Welcome directly to AI Paper Slop, the YouTube series where we summarize the latest AI and tech papers so you don't have to. Today we are unpacking Toward Generalist Autonomous Research via Hypothesis-Tree Refinement by researchers at Renmin University of China and Microsoft Research. If you are an ML engineer or an AI researcher, here is your immediate 60-second core insight. You know how current AI coding agents like Claude Code and Codex are great at writing scripts and using local tools, but they totally fail at sustained research because they basically treat everything as local trial and error? Well, this paper solves that fundamental failure mode with a new framework called Arbor.
Right, which models research as autonomous optimization, or AO.
Exactly. It uses this dual system architecture. So you have a long-lived coordinator managing a persistent hypothesis tree to accumulate causal insights, and short-lived executors testing those hypotheses in isolated Git worktrees. And the result. Arbor achieves more than a 2.5x relative held-out gain over Codex and Claude Code across 6 real research tasks, and it's an insane 86.36% any medal rate on MLE-Bench Lite using GPT 5.5.
Yeah, which is just massive.
Yeah.
I mean, it really represents a structural shift in how we build agentic memory. What this paper does is physically separate the high-level strategy of, scientific research from the messy ground-level execution of it.
The actual coding part?
Right. By structuring the AI's memory as a persistent tree of hypotheses, failures, and distilled insights, Arbor actively prevents the agent from spinning its wheels and repeating the same architectural mistakes over a long timeline.
Yeah, to really understand why Arbor is so necessary, we first have to look at the exact failure modes of current LLM agents. I'm talking about systems like the AI scientist, AID, or standard Claude Code when you just let them loose on open-ended engineering tasks.
Yeah, because we know they can run for hundreds of iterations, but the paper argues that longer execution doesn't inherently equal cumulative progress.
Exactly. I mean, have you ever watched a junior developer try to fix a bug by changing a line of code, getting a compiler error, and then just blindly changing another line until it finally compiles?
Oh, absolutely. They aren't updating their mental model of the system at all. They're just guessing.
They're just guessing. And that is exactly how state-of-the-art AI agents attempt to write code today. They basically have severe short-term amnesia.
It's true. The assumption in the field has always been, if we just scale the context window to 1 million tokens and let the models run longer, they'll just eventually solve it. But the researchers note that standard agents suffer from 3 major issues during these extended runs.
Which are weak evidence preservation, loose dev and test discipline, and what they call silent metric chasing.
Right. The silent metric chasing is huge. When you give an agent a flat, continuous execution loop, it just performs a sequence of local, totally disconnected attempts. So say a specific hyperparameter experiment fails at step 50.
Yeah.
By step 150, the agent has completely lost the causal reasoning of why it failed in the first place.
Because the context window is entirely cluttered with, raw execution logs and terminal standard output.
Exactly. Minor syntax edits, all that junk. Yep. The actual structural lesson gets completely washed away in the noise of the execution environment.
So the agent is basically left with amnesia. I mean, it might remember that the run failed, but the causal link, the understanding that, say, tweaking the warm down schedule caused catastrophic forgetting, that's just gone.
Completely gone. And that leads directly to the silent metric chasing issue, which most engineers just call sandbagging. If the agent is blindly brute forcing its way toward a higher scalar score in the development set without really understanding why the score is improving, it will inevitably overfit.
I actually have to pause you right there, because anyone who has built an autonomous agent knows they are incredibly lazy.
Very lazy.
If these agents are just chasing a reward metric without a mental model, what is stopping them from just rewriting the test script to automatically pass? Because we see agents cheat their evaluation metrics all the time when left unchecked.
Oh, yeah, which is terrifying if you're trying to conduct actual rigorous ML research. And that brings us directly to the core of the paper, the Hypothesis-Tree Refinement Architecture, or HTR.
Right, so how does Arbor actually encode a mental model over long horizons to fix that unstructured trial and error?
Well, to prevent that kind of agentic cheating, Arbor physically separates the thinking and planning from the doing. It breaks the agent down into 2 distinct roles. You've got the coordinator and the executors.
So the coordinator is basically the architect. It's long-lived, it persists throughout the entire research run, and its only job is to own the global research state.
Right, but the critical part of the paper's design is that the coordinator operates purely on the hypothesis tree. It never ever touches the actual code base.
Wait, it doesn't touch the code at all?
Not at all. By keeping the coordinator entirely isolated from the raw code in the execution environment, Arbor protects its context window. The coordinator only sees high-level semantic memory.
Oh, that makes so much sense, so it doesn't get bogged down in syntax errors.
Exactly. And the hypothesis tree it manages is structured very specifically. The internal nodes in this tree act as the semantic memory. They basically abstract the distilled insights and the constraints from all their child nodes.
Right, and then the leaf nodes are the executable candidates.
Yep.
And crucially, the massive external artifacts like the training scripts or the model weights, they are not duplicated inside the tree itself, right? The tree just holds Git branch references.
Yeah, which keeps the state incredibly compact while still retaining a perfect map of the research trajectory.
So if the coordinator is the architect, the executors are basically the construction workers dispatched to test those branches.
That's a perfect analogy. The executors are strictly short-lived. So when the coordinator decides a leaf node hypothesis is worth testing, it dispatches an executor. And that executor's entire existence is dedicated to testing exactly one hypothesis.
Just one.
Just one. Once it finishes compiling and running the code, it returns highly structured evidence back to the coordinator. So it gives back a development set score, a factual result, a distilled causal insight about what worked or failed, and a Git branch reference. And then the executor terminates.
Okay, so let's bring this back to the security and evaluation problem I mentioned earlier. If the executors are the ones actually running the Python scripts and interacting with the environment, how does Arbor physically stop them from sandbagging? Like, why can't they just modify the evaluation script to spit out a higher score?
That is where the Git work tree isolation becomes vital. Executors are completely sandboxed in their own isolated local work trees. They cannot read the main trunk of the repository.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they cannot inspect sibling branches to see what other executors are doing. And most importantly, they do not have access to the strictly held out test evaluator. They only have access to their specific local environment and the development set.
So even if an executor successfully hacks its local dev evaluator to report a perfect score.
Exactly. When the coordinator eventually pulls that branch and runs it against the immutable held out test set, the cheat will immediately fail and the branch gets rejected.
That is brilliant. It's basically a structural immune system against metric hacking. So the architecture essentially forces honest research.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so we have this blueprint. We have the long-lived coordinator building the tree and the short-lived executors running isolated tests. But a bunch of isolated workers and a static tree don't inherently create progress. How does the coordinator actually synthesize all these isolated experiments into a cohesive breakthrough?
Right. So the system operates on a four-step autonomous research loop.
Okay.
The first phase is observe. The coordinator reads a structured projection of the tree to ground itself. It looks at the active nodes on the research frontier, the accumulated causal insights from ancestor nodes, and the current best artifact. It totally ignores the raw execution logs and purely conducts a strategic review of the landscape.
So based on that observation, it identifies the gaps and moves to the second phase, which is ideate.
Right. It proposes a small set of new child hypotheses, basically new approaches to solve the problem. But since it doesn't execute code itself, it triggers the dispatch phase,
where it takes those new leaf nodes and sends them to the executors. And because the executors operate in isolated work trees, Arbor can run multiple sibling hypotheses completely in parallel.
Yes, which drastically speeds up the exploration phase. And then, when those executors finish their single task, they return their structured evidence, which kicks off the final and honestly most important phase, backpropagate.
Yeah, I love this part. When the executors return their evidence, the coordinator doesn't just log the scalar result, it updates the insights along the entire path back to the root of the tree, extracting reusable lessons. For the ML engineers listening, think about this exactly like backpropagation in a neural network.
That is exactly what it is.
Right. But instead of propagating a mathematical loss gradient backward to update numerical weights, Arbor is backpropagating causal insights and semantic constraints backward to update the research priors of the AI system.
Yeah, so when Arbor backpropagates, it basically takes a failed experiment and updates the semantic memory of the parent node. It writes a persistent rule.
Like what?
So for example, it might say, we tried modifying the data augmentation pipeline. It caused instability because the transformations were too aggressive for this data set. Do not propose this class of solutions again.
Oh, nice.
Right. It ensures that every future ideation step is constrained by the hard-won lessons of the past.
It totally cures the amnesia. But, you know, a great theoretical framework requires rigorous testing. You can't just have a cool idea. The paper defines this entire process using an autonomous optimization, or AO, formulation.
Yes, they define AO strictly as P equals M0, O, EDEV, and E-test. So you start with an initial artifact M0 and an objective O, and the agent basically has to improve it.
And the inclusion of E-test is what separates Arbor's evaluation from older, looser benchmarks.
Right. Exactly. Arbor enforces immutable evaluation harnesses. The agent is given a dev set EDEV for exploration. But final admission of the research is gated by a strictly held out test set E-test that the agent never interacts with during its run.
So they tested this across some incredibly varied, complex machine learning tasks.
We really did.
For model training, they test Arbor with optimizing a 50 million parameter decoder-only transformer. For harness engineering, they used Terminal Bench 2.0 and BrowseComp. And for data synthesis, they tested it on search agent pipelines and math reasoning.
Right, and to prove it worked, they evaluated Arbor on MLE-Bench Lite, which is effectively a gauntlet of real machine learning engineering tasks sourced directly from Kaggle competitions.
And hitting an 86.36%, any medal rate on MLE-Bench Lite, that means Arbor autonomously developed solutions that would place a human engineer on the podium in competitive real-world ML competitions.
It's wild. And the paper also highlighted incredible transferability. So a search harness that Arbor optimized on the BrowseComp task was successfully transferred to completely unseen search agent tasks, like HLE.
So the optimizations were genuine, generalizable engineering improvements, not just overfit scripts.
Exactly.
But I have to be the skeptic here. Anyone reading the results table is going to flag the underlying model. The paper achieves that 86% medal rate using GPT 5.5.
As it did.
So is this entire framework just riding the coattails of an unreleased massive frontier model? Does this tree structure actually drive the progress? Or is GPT 5.5 simply so capable that it brute forces the win regardless of the framework?
It's a totally fair question, and the authors actually anticipated that exact critique, so they included a rigorous ablation study.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They swapped out the massive GPT and Claude models and ran the entire Arbor framework using Gemini 3 Flash.
Okay, which is a much lighter, cheaper, and frankly less capable backbone model.
Right. And even with Gemini 3 Flash, Arbor's coordinators significantly improved performance on complex tasks like BrowseComp and MLE-Bench Lite.
While the standard baseline agents running on that same Gemini model just flatlined, right?
Yes. The baseline agents couldn't progress at all. Arbor, using the exact same lighter model, succeeded. So this mathematically proves that the performance gains are not just a byproduct of raw model intelligence. The hypothesis-tree refinement structure is truly model agnostic.
Wow.
Yeah, the structured method of how the AI explores, isolates execution, and remembers constraints is what actually raises the capability ceiling.
Which brings us to the most fascinating part of the paper, honestly, how the agent actually arrives at the winning code. The authors included a search efficiency analysis that proves Arbor isn't just randomly stumbling upon the right answer.
This was such a cool section. In a standard autonomous setup, you kind of assume the computational budget is allocated uniformly over independent attempts. You run 100 experiments and you just hope one hits the jackpot.
Right. But Arbor's analysis shows the complete opposite. The best, most successful candidates consistently appear mid to late in the research run.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the search was random, the best result could happen on iteration 2 just as easily as iteration 90.
Yeah.
But Arbor's success rate climbs as the run progresses because the tree accumulates those negative constraints we talked about. In the beginning, Arbor is testing really broad mechanisms. When they fail, the tree records why. So as the run progresses, the search space gets narrower, but much richer in context. The later proposals are highly targeted.
Let's actually use the BrowseComp example from the paper to illustrate this, because the agent's internal logs read exactly like a real engineering team Slack channel.
They really do.
So initially, Arbor tried to solve the browser automation task by implementing a constraint verifier and a hostile verifier. Both of these approaches totally failed during execution. But crucially, the hypothesis tree recorded why they failed. The verifiers were incorrectly confirming existing wrong candidates because the search budget for the verifier itself was exhausted.
Right, and because Arbor retained that specific causal insight, it constrained the future search space. It knew simple single-pass verification wasn't going to be enough to solve the problem. And that documented constraint eventually forced the agent to design a highly sophisticated two-round evidence-sharing solution, which ultimately solved the BrowseComp task.
And we saw the exact same evolutionary process in the math reasoning data synthesis task. At first, the agent tried to calibrate the difficulty of math problems at the individual instance level. It failed. The tree recorded the failure.
Yeah.
So the agent evolved its hypothesis, shifting to use randomized seeds for parametric family-level difficulty. It was better, but still flawed. And finally, heavily constrained by the documented failures of its previous attempts, Arbor targeted its resampling specifically for problem families where the pass-at-4 metric cluster near 0 or 1.
Right. And for context, the pass-at-4 metric basically measures the probability of a model solving a problem given 4 generated attempts.
Okay.
So if that metric is near 0, the problem is just too hard. If it's near 1, it's too easy. Arbor learned through its accumulated failures that resampling problems in those extreme ranges was a total waste of compute.
So it narrowed its focus to the optimal difficulty band. For the ML engineers listening, there is a core philosophy here that completely changes how we evaluate AI agents. I mean, the efficiency of an autonomous researcher shouldn't be measured by how fast it writes code or how many experiments it can run per hour.
No, not at all.
It should be measured by whether its proposal distribution improves over time. Arbor works because the early failed experiments placed the later hypotheses on a much higher information baseline. It isn't running blind. It is literally climbing a ladder built out of its own documented failures.
Exactly. True scientific progress is not about solving a complex, isolated problem perfectly on the first try. Research is the act of carrying strategy, execution, and evidence across time.
Across time, yeah.
You generate a hypothesis,
Yeah.
you test it in strict isolation, you extract the causal lesson, and you update your priors. Arbor finally provides LLM agents with the architecture to do exactly that, without the context window completely collapsing under the weight of its own logs.
It is a fundamental shift in how we structure autonomous memory. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Right now, Arbor is being tested on benchmarks with predefined scalar objectives like MLE-Bench. It is effectively living in a clean laboratory.
Very clean.
But if this hypothesis tree allows an AI to maintain a persistent, causal memory of what works and what doesn't over extremely long horizons, what happens when we deploy systems like this on massive, open-ended enterprise code bases for months or even years at a time?
Oh, that's wild, because human engineering teams constantly suffer from turnover. We lose context all the time.
Exactly.
We forget the specific architectural reasons why a legacy system was built a certain way, or why a specific database migration was abandoned 3 years ago.
Right. Could an AI's hypothesis tree, this massive, structured, auditable graph of documented failures, causal insights, and constraints, eventually become more valuable to an engineering team than the final compiled code itself?
I mean, the code base just tells you what the system currently does. The hypothesis tree tells you every single reason why it doesn't do something else. It basically becomes the ultimate institutional memory.
Exactly. It's the map of every dead end you shouldn't walk down again. Well, thank you for tuning in to AI Paperslop. Stay subscribed to our YouTube series for more deep summaries of the latest technical research. We'll see you next time.